Elsewhere, photos of Sang family members filled a screen. Analysts dismissed some as harmless, praised Donggi's growing influence, and criticized Soyun's greed. Then Dijun's photo appeared. The room grew tense as they realized the chairman's second-generation grandson had both access and money. They uncovered his fortune, his ties to fantasy investment, and his unusual privilege of private meetings with the chairman. Even the vice chairman didn't have that access. The room fell silent. Back at a cafe, Dijun asked Kim if he was sure they were being followed. Kim confirmed it. Dijun handed him a thick envelope, telling him to use it when needed. Kim stared, shocked. Dijun said money was a tool, nothing more. If Kim wanted to become someone important, he had to choose his own path first. Kim slipped the money away and followed him without a word. Later, a secretary entered and said they had a guest. Dijun looked up calmly. It was the chairman of Dihan Group. San and the hero exchanged surprised looks. The secretary froze in confusion. San calmly asked her to request a short wait. Dijun said he'd be in the conference room next door and asked to turn on the intercom. San slipped on his jacket, muttering that it wouldn't be good if he was seen since he'd just been on TV. Dijun pulled up his hood and smiled. San smiled back. The chairman stepped inside. The hero walked past him in silence. The chairman turned and watched him leave. San bowed and offered a handshake. The chairman smiled, thanking him for welcoming such an unexpected guest and hoping he wasn't disturbing him. San shook his hand warmly and said there was nowhere in Korea he'd be treated like an intruder. He gestured to the sofa and invited him to sit. The chairman removed his hat and asked how an investment company could seriously aim for Ain Motors. San answered modestly, but the chairman cut him off, saying there was no need for false humility since they were equals now. San asked if rumors really spread that fast. The chairman frowned, realizing that even if the rumor were true, San wasn't even trying to hide it. He dismissed the guard and closed the door. The chairman said since San was being open, he would be honest too. He asked what San wanted. San smiled and said he wanted Ain Motors. The chairman raised an eyebrow and asked if an investment firm shouldn't just invest and exit. He told San to name a price to avoid a pointless fight. San frowned and asked if he was really being offered money to withdraw. The chairman nodded, saying price wars without reason were exhausting. San shook his head and said he was misunderstood. Their investors had plenty of money and wanted some fun. He added casually that they were car enthusiasts, so manufacturers interested them. The chairman's veins bulged. Buying a company for fun stunned him. He realized negotiation was pointless. He warned that one article about foreign capital draining national wealth would be enough to crush San. San smiled and replied that once the auction price was revealed, Koreans would decide who was more patriotic. The chairman stared speechless. His phone rang. He ignored it and demanded to know what San wanted. He proposed using public funds to cover all gaps and competing purely on acquisition price. No politics, no pressure. San smiled and said in that case, whoever won would suffer minimal damage. The chairman asked if they were truly suggesting unified debt terms and competition only on price. San confirmed it calmly. Silence filled the room. San raised his hand and said since the chairman proposed simplifying things first, he'd accept the rules. Wrestling only became a sport once rules existed. The chairman stood, calling San amusing. He said it had been a long time since he took a confrontation seriously. Pressing his hat to his chest, he said Dihan Group was built through brutal fights, not easy ones. The door slammed. San collapsed into the chair. Dijun entered. San rubbed his neck and asked if the conditions would be accepted. Dijun smiled and said most likely. Elsewhere, Dihan Group executives gathered. Numbers flew across the table. Ain Motors' debt stood at over 3 trillion won. Subsidiary write-offs exceeded 1.5 trillion. Additional concessions pushed total relief past 7 trillion. The chairman frowned. Not accepting fantasy terms means starting over. Someone asked if fantasy really had that much money. No one knew, only that American capital backed them. Then one subordinate mentioned Hollywood. Based on intelligence from Magi Corporation, Fantasy had invested in nearly every major successful film. None had failed. The room went silent. The chairman closed his eyes. Someone reminded him that refusing an outstretched hand often led to bleeding. At Yang Chao's house, he sipped tea and asked if Kibao truly came in person. Di Jun confirmed it and explained the compensation offer. Yang Chao laughed, saying Kibao must be desperate to move first. He asked what Di Jun suggested. Di Jun said he proposed competing only on acquisition price, while keeping government benefits intact. Yang Chao asked what Kibao said. Di Jun quoted him saying he'd take the confrontation seriously. Yang Chao laughed and said the man must have skipped his medicine. He asked what Kibao would do next. Di Jun answered that Yang Chao himself would accept. Fixed variables were safer than new ones. Yang Chao smiled. A businessman's greatest fear was uncertainty. He said Di Jun had played all his cards, but Kibao hadn't. Now it was time for a wider attack. Media, creditors, government agencies, even the assembly would apply pressure. Di Jun asked if Yang Chao could help further. Yang Chao said no. Even helping more would hurt everyone. He explained he'd already stopped Chairman Sun Ai's arrest, and that alone raised suspicion. Di Jun realized government pressure had limits. Pulling both sides would tear the system apart. He decided to work something out with San instead. Yang Chao asked if he planned to beg. Di Jun smiled and said no, he trusted San. Yang Chao asked if he was certain that there were two people you kept close, those who could do the job and those willing to sacrifice for you. Yang Chao smiled and said such people gather naturally when someone shines. That evening, guests filled the hall. Drinks flowed. A wedding couple stood proudly, a massive diamond on the bride's hand. Di Jun watched them, thinking how transactional it all felt. Someone recognized him and shouted that rumors were true. The bride praised Yanan's looks. Di Jun congratulated him. Soon Di Jun was left chatting with the bride. She praised him openly, calling him the envy of everyone. He was lucky not to inherit responsibility and could simply enjoy life. Di Jun smiled awkwardly and said money only mattered if it stayed. She laughed, calling him the chairman's favorite. He joked about receiving only a racing car he couldn't drive. She teased that maybe a bigger gift was coming. Di Jun excused himself and left. Later in the restroom, Kim appeared serious. He said something was wrong. Dajun replied, telling him to wait in his car at the parking lot, and he would be back as quickly as possible. In the parking lot, a man joined them. He introduced himself as Shim, where before Shim replied that they had once met at Yanjin Villa. Then he gave the hero a ride home. Di Jun opened his eyes in surprise as he remembered the beating in the parking lot. Shim said time was short, so he would get straight to the point. He explained that their department was dealing with the third-generation Kim. Looked anxiously toward the back seat. Shim said that about a month ago, they noticed someone had started following everyone from the third generation. Di Jun asked in fear if it was really behind all of them. Shim looked at the hero seriously and said yes, they were not testing the waters, they were simply monitoring his movements. Di Jun then asked if Yanjin was being followed too. He explained they were tracking surveillance on all third-generation heirs. Di Jun realized it wasn't just him. Shim admitted they lacked power and future. Strategy teams never survived long. They needed a roof. Di Jun listened, then calmly said this wasn't loyalty. It was a deal. They worked for him, he paid. Price could be money or a future. Shim agreed without hesitation. Di Jun looked out the window and said if they wanted more, they'd have to earn it. Kim swallowed hard. Di Jun said that starting tomorrow he'd take taxis instead. The tail had to follow carefully, slow enough not to be exposed. Kim answered immediately that he could handle it. Dijun turned to Shim and said that from now on all reports from the strategy team would come to him first. He'd mark anything sensitive in red before it went upstairs. Shim smiled and said he understood. Dijun added that all expenses were covered. If they needed money for anything personal, they could come to him directly. He made it clear they would never have to worry about money again. The room went silent. Dijun closed his eyes and realized how much he'd gained today, and a clearer picture of who to watch. The TV flickered. A Japanese flag appeared. A news anchor reported that fantasy investments funds were allegedly coming from Japan, and that Ain Motors could become a bridge for Japan's auto industry into Korea. San crossed his arms, teeth clenched. He said if anti-Japanese sentiment took hold, they'd be finished. They needed a press conference immediately. Dijun replied calmly that articles like this never appeared without a reason. San remembered the smiling old man and realized Dihan Group was playing dirty. At the press conference, cameras flashed. San stated clearly that the rumors were false. Fantasy had made short-term investments in Japan, taken profits and exited. A journalist asked if the profits stayed in the U.S. San answered that all of it would be reinvested into rebuilding Ain Motors. Another reporter questioned why an investment firm would take on such a risky acquisition. A woman accused them of acting as agents for Japan. San snapped, demanding to know who started the Japan narrative. Behind the cameras, Dijun adjusted his cap. This was exactly the message they needed. Chairman Song stepped forward and confirmed Ain Group's full support. Union leaders stood behind him, promising wage freezes and cooperation until recovery. He declared that there would be no layoffs. The room went quiet. Song said corporations weren't just profit machines. They carried people's livelihoods. He accused Dihan Group of planning mass layoffs under the excuse of restructuring. Reporters scribbled furiously. He knew the key was speed. No time for Dihan to counterattack. Later, the TV showed analysis clips. Global auto wars. Only the top 10 would survive. If Ajin merged with Dihyun, costs would drop, efficiency would soar, and jobs would multiply. The screen went dark. San sighed. The stock price hadn't moved. Public opinion was split cleanly in half. Dijun said that was good. Both sides already accepted Ain would be taken over. San muttered that Chaebol's controlling the media was terrifying. Dijun corrected him quietly. It wasn't fear. The media just knew the taste of money. That night, Dijun offered San a drink. He reminded him he was an adult now. San hesitated until Dijun pulled out an unlimited card. No limit. San stared in horror. Dijun said it was pocket money from Hanson Ilbo's daughter, a matter of face for third-generation heirs. San laughed helplessly and promised to take him somewhere unforgettable. The long corridor was lit by grand chandeliers, drinks, and fruits lined the table. San held a glass goblet, his eyes closed for a moment before he slowly looked away. The man scanned the table, sensing that the main character was hiding some incredible idea. Though he couldn't tell what it was, San smiled calmly and said that truly great people always create ideas out of nothing. Later, Dijun returned home late. His grandfather asked if he drank. Dijun said not much. The old man snapped, asking if he felt like a loser. Dijun answered calmly that the fight wasn't over. His grandfather scolded him for clinging to finished battles and ordered him to analyze his mistakes. Dijun admitted he underestimated Dihan's meticulousness and ruthlessness. The old man warned him that before striking, you must know how strong the enemy's fist is. Dijun said he rushed and missed the timing. He didn't expect them to twist Japanese investment into a weapon. The old man demanded he remember this feeling. Then Dijun said he needed his final card. His grandfather raised an eyebrow. Dijun said Sang Motors could fall at any moment. He explained that announcing a merger between Ain and Sang would flip the board instantly. The old man exploded, accusing him of greed. Dijun replied calmly that being half greedy was pointless. If fingers were going to point anyway, they might as well point fully. Silence followed. The grandfather said mergers united everything into one whole, and Dijun didn't even own Ain yet. Dijun replied that negotiations existed to turn jokes into reality and dreams into contracts. If the scales didn't balance, you added weight. He said he'd put more weight down. The old man listened. Dijun explained the two weapons, Sang's name heavier than Dihan and confidence, fairness, stability. Speculation would vanish overnight. The old man crossed his arms and closed his eyes. Then he said calmly, he still wasn't satisfied. Dijun frowned, thin brows tightening as his fist clenched. He knew he was greedy, but this wasn't greed alone. It was alignment. And right now, he wasn't sure whether his grandfather was testing him or simply refusing to hand over Sang Motors. Keeping his voice calm, Dijun made his move. He told his grandfather to leave all subsidiary shares untouched and put only Sang Motors itself on the scale. If that happened, he promised, he would tip the balance. The old man's eyes widened. Was he suggesting splitting Sang Motors apart? Dijun grinned and calmly listed 8 subsidiaries, including Ain Motors and Sayang Motors. Separate them properly, he said, and a new auto giant would be born. The old man fell silent. Dijun watched his face carefully. That wasn't rejection. That was disappointment, which meant the old man wanted more. So Dijun pressed forward. He said they should immediately announce a full merger between Sang Motors and Ain Motors. The moment the market heard that Sang's subsidiaries were being spun off, Sang's stock would crash. The old man's eyes widened again. Dijun continued smoothly. When the stock hit rock bottom, he would quietly buy it under borrowed names. Interest flickered across the old man's face. Then Dijun added the final layer. After Ain was absorbed and the partial merger completed, the subsidiary split would be cancelled. Sang Group would grow stronger, and Ain Group could later be absorbed entirely. The old man asked sharply if investors wouldn't swarm in, furious over losses. Dijun smiled. When a massive cart moves forward, ants get crushed. If you stop for every ant, the cart never moves. The old man warned that buying shares this way would make Dijun one of Sayang's major shareholders. Dijun asked calmly if that wasn't a gift that came a little too easily. Dijun's lips curled. He'd passed. That same night, Yahello sat stiffly as executives gasped in shock. He announced they would take over Ain Group. Someone warned they had no time and not enough money. Yahello lowered his head and said they'd simply hook their leg onto Dihan's leg as it ran. Confusion rippled through the room. He explained calmly, if Fantasy acquired Ain Group, Sang Motors would merge with Ain Motors. That was his role. Eyes widened. Only Sayang Motors would be separated. It would merge with Ain. A new automobile conglomerate would be born, and Tu would become its first CEO. Sweat beaded on Tu's forehead. He pointed out that regardless of merger ratio, Fantasy Investment would still be the main shareholder. Yahello smiled. Fantasy's CEO had already extended his hand. If Tu hesitated now, he'd become a dog chasing a chicken. The chairman added casually that Tu himself once said he wanted to create a new car company and hand it over fully packaged. Someone tried to argue about Fantasy. Yahello cut it off. They were money players. Packaging would be expensive, very expensive. He told Tu to prepare. In another office, Sean raised his hand. He asked what was so difficult about spinning off Sang Motors and merging it with Ain. Dijun grinned. The merger ratio could wait. If his grandfather didn't yield, the owner would change. Sean snapped, asking what that even meant. Dijun smiled coldly. His grandfather never backed down after mixing blood into his plans. He took everything first, then shared crumbs. Sean fell silent. Dijun stood by the window, hands in his pockets. By the time the buyer was confirmed and the merger began, winter would arrive. A brutal one. San Dihan, even the government would be drained. At that point, his grandfather would have no choice. Cameras flashed. Sean announced publicly that Sang Motors would spin off its subsidiaries, merge with Ain Motors, and lead the creation of a specialized automobile corporation. Reporters erupted with questions about fantasy, about leadership, about power. Elsewhere, a remote control smashed against a TV screen. Batteries scattered across the floor. The man stood up, furious, demanding to know how this happened without anyone noticing. No one answered. He barked orders, 2 hours, every contact, every cousin, every civil servant, every bank employee. Use every brain available. Under a clear blue sky, a door slammed open. Yi burst in, saying it was impossible. Yanao didn't look up. He calmly poured tea and told him to sit down. And drink. The man stepped forward, fists clenched, demanding to know if his father was really abandoning the automotive industry. What wasn't enough for him anymore? Yang Qiao calmly sipped his tea and said he regretted nothing. He had reviewed every weakness in the company, stacked them together, and made a decision. Yang Yi exploded. He shouted that his father hadn't said a single word to him, that he learned everything from television, that this was a core subsidiary issue. Was this all he deserved as vice president? Yang Qiao looked up, veins bulging with anger. He said President Tu personally delivered the documents with his written decision. Tu was the one who announced the merger. Must have been entertaining, watching Yang Yi's face when those papers were handed over. Yang Yi accused him of treating him like a rag doll. Yang Qiao set the mug down and coldly asked if he was finished. When Yang Yi didn't understand, Yang Qiao smiled faintly and asked whether the visit was only to vent anger. Yang Yi snapped. Yang Qiao slammed his palm on the table and shouted for him to stop. Silence fell. Then Yang Qiao roared that if Yang Yi was ashamed of his vice president's business card, he could leave. Any man in Korea would kill for that card. All Yang Yi did to earn it was be born as his son. He pointed at him and said bluntly that without his bloodline, Yang Yi wouldn't even qualify as an executive director. Yang Yi's lips trembled, tears filled his eyes, he lowered his head. Yang Qiao finally placed a hand on his shoulder. He said calmly that even if Yang Yi wasn't outstanding, this place was still his. All he had to do was think about Sang Group's future and protect it. Nothing more. The old man exhaled heavily, realizing he was consoling a 40-year-old son at 70. Elsewhere, photos lay on a table. Sean, Dijun. They'd been seen together days earlier. Someone reported that Jun met Haki and Tu, then left before the others arrived. Another said Hyan rushed to the chairman's house right after the merger announcement. Dongyi smiled dismissively. He said Jun wasn't dangerous, too young, just polish. If the chairman wanted a successor, he'd have sent him to business school. Jun, he said, was just varnish, decoration. Still, they were told to keep watching him, because Sang Motors stock was falling, and smart people were already buying. At dinner, Yanjan leaned forward and asked Jun if he knew about the merger in advance. Jun admitted he found out the day before the announcement. Yanjan demanded how. Jun said Sean asked him to consult their grandfather because Dihan was watching the CEO closely. Meeting directly would have raised alarms. Yanjan exploded. Jun stayed calm and said there was a secret contract between the CEO and the chairman. No one else knew, not even the vice chairman. Yanjan shouted that Jun had no authority. Jun replied quietly that authority comes from access, and some agreements only involve 2 people. That was when Yanjan realized something was wrong. Jun reminded him that the eldest uncle wasn't informed either, which meant inheritance wasn't settled, which meant decisions could change any time. Yanjian accused him of trying to replace his father. Jun smiled and said he wasn't competing at all. He wasn't greedy. He could study, pass the bar, become a prosecutor or judge, live well, never worry about money. He listed it casually: respect, power, women, freedom. Yanjian tried to threaten him with his father's wealth. Jun saw through it immediately. He smiled and said being the youngest in a chaebol family was a blessing. Less pressure, more options. Then he planted the final seed. He said the second and third sons wouldn't just sit quietly and watch the group pass to Yanjian's father. Yanjian's eyes widened. Jun didn't confirm or deny anything. He just folded his arms and looked away. Then he said calmly that if power skips the rightful line, history always ends in blood. And he imagined it splattering. The young man said that this was exactly why he wanted the eldest uncle to take the chairman's seat of the Siang group. Jun smiled and said that this was the only way their family would not suffer. Yonan smiled faintly, but then leaned his elbows on the table and lowered his head, sighing heavily, saying that Jun could not possibly know all the details. Jun remembered their earlier conversation in the office, Yonan's unkind smile, and the dissatisfaction written clearly on his face like that of a grown adult hiding his true thoughts. Jun calmly said that, as a result of the merger with Siang Motors, the shares owned by its subsidiaries would be transferred to another branch, which would then become one of the most important companies in the group. Wasn't that correct? The man admitted that it was true. Jun folded his hands on the table and asked what would happen if the management of that company was not headed by the eldest uncle. Yonan's eyes widened as he realized Jun was talking about the contents of the secret agreement. Jun frowned slightly, thinking that this was actually something anyone could figure out if they thought about it carefully. With a calm face, he said that he had only seen the title of the document, the Group Management Reorganization Plan. The man froze, beads of sweat forming on his forehead as he nervously repeated the name. Jun, sitting across from him, said that this was the greatest help he could offer, and that from now on everything would remain with his uncle. The man agreed. Yonan bared his teeth and lowered his head while Jun grinned, thinking that because of Siang Motors, the claws each of them hid would gradually be exposed, and they would soon find out whose claws were sharper. Jun smiled as he imagined his family. Outside, the windows reflected a clear blue sky. A newspaper article reported that Fantasy Investments had been chosen as the new owner of the Inc. Group. The man read the paper intently, saying that in the end things had turned out like this. Although they had secured Ain, he was worried that Siang would eventually take everything from them. Jun smiled and asked when the takeover payment was due, and replied that it would be immediately after the merger. 1.2 trillion won, meaning $1 billion would need to be transferred. Jun asked whether that meant it wouldn't happen until next year. Sian raised his eyebrows and said it was worth asking the chairman, as he might want to rush the merger before the end of the year. The total amount was $3.2 billion, and at the current exchange rate of 1,110 won per dollar, that was slightly over 3.5 trillion won. The man took a sip through a straw and asked how much cash they had on hand. Looking out the window, he said they had $600 million in cash as requested, with no new investments this year, and another 600 million would return next year. Jun furrowed his brows, calculating that it would be enough, since the money he had invested using his memories had returned more than 100-fold. He wondered what would have happened if instead of him, an ordinary worker reborn as a fund manager from Wall Street, someone like that would probably already be the richest man in the world. His thoughts were interrupted when Sian said he would first transfer $1 billion so they could repay it at any time. Jun raised his head and said there was no need for that yet since they still had to pay by the end of the year. Sian looked at him in surprise and leaned forward, asking if Jun had also noticed how strange the exchange rate growth was. Jun replied that everyone had noticed and had been worried for a long time, but they were all pretending not to see it. The rate had jumped by 251 in a single month, and it felt as if the dollar was slipping away like water. The man asked whether the exchange rate could correct itself by the end of the year. He knew Sion wasn't blind to it, but like everyone else, he was asking useless questions to hide the approaching typhoon of conglomerate bankruptcies and presidential elections. Jun asked whether exchange rate fluctuations and the dollar's departure were really the same thing, and whether that meant there was no point in holding tens of trillions in reserves if the dollar disappeared. He smiled and said that on a deserted island, a box of bread would be worth far more than 10 billion won in cash. Sion arched his eyebrows, realizing that the bread Jun was referring to was the dollar itself. Jun nodded, thinking that soon the IMF would collapse and it would become impossible to obtain dollars even if you wanted to. Sion clasped his hands and frowned, asking what Jun would do if the exchange rate kept rising and whether he planned to pay for ain in dollars. Jun smiled and said he had already thought about the negotiations. Sion asked what he meant, and Jun replied that he would cut the price by offering to pay for the acquisition in dollars. Then burst out laughing, hitting his forehead and saying that even if you had a gold nugget, it was useless if you were already on the brink of death, and it would be better to exchange it for a life jacket. Jun imagined money flowing through an IV, thinking that the dollar as a global currency was like blood to a living body. If circulation stopped, the body died, while someone holding a bag of blood could freely pull a gold nugget from the dead person's pocket. Sion frowned and said that when domestic foreign exchange reserves hit rock bottom, Jun would be their savior. Jun smiled and said it wouldn't be him, but his uncle, the CEO of Fantasy Investments. Sion leaned back, grinning, and said Jun still didn't want to show himself, either because he was young or because he had ulterior motives. Jun folded his arms and asked what people would say if they found out he owned trillions through illegal gifting and disguised inheritance. Everyone would be watching him. Sion said that hiding behind someone else would let him avoid those countless eyes. Jun nodded, and Sion laughed, saying he would gladly become Jun's horse, letting him pull the reins and crack the whip as he pleased, but there wasn't much time left since he was already 50. 5 years at most, after that Jun would have to run himself or find another horse. Jun stood up in shock, asking if he meant retirement at 55. Sion smiled and said that with that much money, it was more than fair to enjoy life. Jun froze as Sion pointed at him, saying he was giving him 5 years because he saw him more as a nephew than his own blood. Otherwise, he would have already left to live on some secluded island. That night, the Sion group building glowed brightly under the sky. The man asked if it was true, and Jun replied that he had seen it with his own eyes. The man clenched his hand, remembering how his father had patted his shoulder and promised him the chairman's seat while secretly trying to reorganize management behind his back. Yonan froze, eyes wide, and the man cleared his throat, saying that if the merger split, they just needed to survive, since the structure would shake but not collapse. When Jun started to explain further, Yonggi interrupted him, saying everything was fine and that Jun should focus on stabilizing the steel mill and rebranding it as Siang, telling him not to miss this opportunity to prove himself to his grandfather. Jun bowed and left. Alone, the man grabbed the phone and shouted for everyone from the planning department to gather immediately, then rubbed his eyes, knowing he had to act before his father made another strange decision. Later, Tio entered the office, apologized with a smile for interrupting, and joked that he might finally have time to eat a bowl of rice together. Dongi laughed and invited him to sit, saying he still wasn't sure who would benefit more from Ain and Siang joining, though his father had done a great job. Tio replied that everything had happened so fast it left him confused. Dongi wondered whether the old man would really pretend ignorance to the end, then remarked that since the division had occurred, President Cho was no longer related to Siang, and Tio must be upset. Tio looked at him silently, then asked whether Dongi was serious or testing him. When Dongi insisted it was just idle thought, Tio replied calmly that instead of joining Siang, Ain had simply been absorbed. Realizing his mistake, Dongi broke into a cold sweat. Tio then spoke about his 30 years as chairman and recalled the only time he had ever protested, during an oil crisis when they flew to Texas and shared a single steak. Dongi laughed, saying American steaks were always huge, but Tia coldly replied that he had wanted his own portion. When Dongi realized that even a steak wasn't divided, he understood that the group would never be divided either. Tio said that if you take too much, you just eat it all, and Dongi smiled madly, vowing to finish a 600-gram steak himself. Then Tio calmly said that Vice President Jin Yonggi, Dongi's older brother and the chairman's eldest son, would inherit the group. Dongi exploded in anger, shouting that Yonggi was incompetent, but Tio replied that incompetent people cannot help competent ones. Dongi raged, proposing splitting branches and land, but Tio refused, saying he would not support plans that discredited the company. In despair, Dongi realized there was no designated successor, and that the chairman would choose only at the very end. This was a warning, Dongi thought, a reminder that even if the carriage owner changed, the coachman remained. The confrontation had only just begun. The next day, sunlight poured through the windows of a massive building. Dongi entered his brother Yonggi's office with a forced smile. Yonggi asked why he had come, joking that Dongi hadn't visited in 10 years. The office was filled wall to wall with documents. Dongi's voice echoed through the office as he said that he had earned a lot of money during this time, then pointed around at the cluttered room and asked what all this was supposed to be. Yonggi immediately replied that these were nothing but absurd rumors, adding that Dongi himself should try earning at least something here, because even the budget of a single department in his company was larger than this. Hearing that, Dongi lost his temper and threw his hand out, shouting that he couldn't tolerate it anymore, and that tomorrow he would send someone to expand Yonggi's office. Yonggi calmly replied that it wasn't necessary because he still needed to pay off his debt. Dongi froze for a moment, then asked in confusion if Yonggi really had a debt. Yonggi smiled broadly and waved his hands, telling him not to panic because it wasn't a private loan, then reminded him of Jun's starting capital. Dongi clicked his tongue in realization and pointed at Yonggi, who rubbed the back of his neck and said that he needed to return it because their father had taken a child's money. Dongi sat down in a chair and said that since Yonggi earned well and didn't waste money, he could easily pay it back. Yonggi said it was time to get down to business and asked what kind of wind had blown Dongi here today. Dongi leaned back against the chair, thinking silently, then asked whether Yonggi really intended to keep walking this path. Yonggi looked at him in surprise and asked what he meant. Dongi's expression hardened as he asked whether movie production was really Yonggi's final stop. Yonggi hesitated, unsure how to answer, asked whether he was telling him not to even look toward the group. Dongi answered firmly that he meant exactly that, adding Yonggi and his son to the sentence. Yonggi stiffened, the warmth vanishing from his face as an uncomfortable silence settled between them. Folding his arms, Yonggi asked what Dongi meant, reminding him there was also a third brother. Dongi waved his hand irritably and said that Sangi hadn't been his younger brother for a long time and was nothing more than a name now. Yonggi touched his chin in thought, and Dongi slammed his hands onto the armrests, shouting at him for reacting like that and asking if he was really hiding his greed. Adjusting his glasses, Yonggi replied calmly that it wasn't greed, but that until now he hadn't fulfilled his role as a father properly, so he intended to start now. Dongi stared at him in shock and asked if he was talking about Jun. Yonggi nodded slowly and said yes, explaining that Jun dreamed of becoming an entrepreneur like his grandfather. Dongi froze in disbelief. Yonggi smiled faintly and explained that Jun wasn't petty enough to want control over a few subsidiaries and that his son would achieve everything through his own abilities. Dongi could only stare in silence as Yonggi added that he would do everything he could to support him. Dongi asked what that had to do with the group, and Yonggi replied awkwardly that even though Jun was the youngest grandson, he still carried the chairman's blood, so if something was offered he would accept it, and if not, he would take only his fair share. Dongi repeated the words fair share under his breath, displeased, then looked up without responding. Yoongi leaned back and said that since Dongi had come so suddenly, something must have happened with his older brother, then asked whether the shares had been shaken because of Seong Motors. Dongi immediately denied it, stood up, adjusted his jacket, and told Yoongi to stay where he was and support him, promising that if he won, he would give Yoongi a fair share, enough for Jun to achieve his dream. Yoongi asked quietly what would happen if the other brother won, and Dongi replied coldly that then Yoongi would have to fight his brother in order to become a father. As Dongi was leaving, he noticed a movie poster on the wall and asked what kind of film it was. Yoongi replied that it was scheduled for release early next year and that they were looking for theaters. Dongi patted his shoulder and said that if the tickets didn't sell, he would buy them all. Yoongi smiled and thanked him. That evening, the lights were on in Yoongi's house as Soyeon and her husband sat on the sofa. Yoongi asked why they had come so late just to ask for money. Soyeon admitted it awkwardly, and Yoongi wondered if something serious had happened in the family that he had missed. He asked why the owners of a department store were borrowing money from a film company. Soyeon nervously explained that her father had invested almost everything into the steel mill and had restricted the department store's budget, forcing her to report daily income and expenses. Confused, Yoongi asked what she had done wrong, and she suddenly shouted that it was her husband's fault, pointing at him and explaining that he wanted to challenge the mayor of Seoul in the next election, so her father had cut all funding. Her husband lowered his head in embarrassment. Soyeon then said she heard Yoongi had struck gold with his film and asked if he had received the profits. Irritated, Yoongi asked how much money she thought a movie could make in Korea, then answered himself, saying that with ticket prices at just over 6,000 won and around 670,000 viewers, revenue would be roughly 4 billion won before deducting distribution and production costs. Without waiting for a response, he told them to stop this nonsense. The couple left awkwardly, and after seeing them off, Yoongi rubbed his eyes in exhaustion. As they stepped outside, a surprised voice called out, and it was Jun, who had just returned home. He asked his aunt why she had come so late. Moments later, Jun entered the house and removed his shoes. Passing by his father's room, he noticed Yoongi sitting on the couch, who asked if they could talk. Jun entered, rubbing his neck, saying he would try to come home earlier in the future, but Yoongi smiled and said he wasn't the kind of father who controlled when an adult came home. 2 cups of tea sat on the table as Yoongi mentioned that Dongi had visited earlier and that Soyeon and her husband had also come. Jun replied that he had met his aunt on the way in. Yoongi took a sip of tea while Jun wondered what his father was about to say. Setting the cup down, Yoongi smiled and said that Jun was definitely his son, yet nothing like him at all. Jun was left speechless as Yoongi continued, saying he was proud of Jun's artistic sense, but that Jun didn't even listen to popular music and found counting money boring, yet was born with an extraordinary sense for investing. Cold sweat broke out on Jun's face as he wondered why his father had started this conversation and whether he knew the truth. Yoongi noticed his unease and smiled, then said he already knew everything from Seon. Shocked, Jun asked what he meant, and Yoongi proudly stated that Jun's net worth exceeded 3 trillion won and that he had acquired Inc. Group, effectively owning an investment company tied to Hollywood. Jun realized bitterly that his uncle couldn't keep secrets, then remembered that his father and uncle were bound by deep trust from their youth. Yoongi laughed and said Jun now had the same face he once had when hearing about all this. Jun bowed and apologized for not telling him sooner, and Yoongi folded his arms and said he was actually grateful. He asked whether Jun really thought he would believe that a high school student with 20 billion won could negotiate fluently in English. Yoongi then said calmly that it was cool, that he was proud not because of the money but because of Jun's talent. He asked whether Jun wanted to take over Seong Group, and Jun replied that it was only a tool, not his goal. When asked about his dream, Jun said he wanted to build a conglomerate that surpassed Seong Group, starting from scratch and acquiring subsidiaries from Seong and other conglomerates alike. Yoongi asked in disbelief whether Seong Group was just a stall to him, and Jun replied that he didn't want to be handed the company but wanted to earn everything himself. Smiling contentedly, Yoongi said that if that was his son's dream, he had worried for nothing. He admitted he had been considering confronting his brothers or negotiating for cash or shares. As he left, he said he hated quarrels and negotiations that hurt his pride, wished Jun good night, and told him to sleep. Jun reached out in confusion, insisting everything was wrong, but outside under the night sky, Jun's voice echoed again as he asked to speak with his father a little longer. An image appeared of several classic cars lined up in a parking lot. With his hands in his pockets, the protagonist walked slowly between two rows of vehicles and glanced around, noting just how many had gathered here. He climbed the stairs toward a massive building, where more than a dozen men in suits were seated around a huge table. Yang-il spoke first, stating that foreign currency flowing into the company must not be spent, not dollars, not yen, not even marks. He said urgent foreign payments still had to be handled because banks were refusing to release their dollar reserves and were holding onto them tightly. With his hands folded and eyes closed, the gray-haired man sat in silence. After a moment, he opened his eyes and asked whether anyone had tried contacting the deputy prime minister. Looking around the room, he asked if they had called him. The chief secretary lowered his gaze and replied that the calls were being ignored. Grinding his teeth slightly, the chairman said it was obvious, since the call was effectively coming from him, and politicians were now avoiding businessmen altogether. Lifting his head, he coldly asked what the maximum amount was they could gather by collecting all unclaimed funds within the group. Hatch answered that if all urgent payments were completed by year-end, it would be a little over 400 billion won, since the acquisition of hand steel had already been paid in a lump sum, and money was still flowing there. Yang Cha pressed his lips together, then raised his head and spoke loudly, telling everyone to listen carefully. He declared that instead of giving away money they were supposed to give, they should demand the money they were supposed to receive immediately and convert it into dollars at once. A dark-haired man with glasses said that even offering above market price wouldn't work because there simply were no dollars available. Someone said that an economic singularity was approaching, and that even if the exchange rate hit 3,101 per dollar, dollars would still be impossible to obtain due to severe shortages. The chairman pursed his lips and closed his eyes, and the room fell silent. One representative adjusted his glasses nervously, and someone mentioned Ain. The chairman suddenly opened his eyes wide and impulsively asked if they truly had a secret vault of dollars. The chief secretary replied that not exactly, clarifying that the acquisition price was 1.2 trillion won. The chairman's eyes widened further as he leaned forward and struck the table, smiling as he exclaimed that this was fantasy money, crisp green dollars that definitely existed. Hatch nodded with a smile and said they could exchange currency worth 1.2 trillion won and easily cover the remainder with a bank loan, since there was only a dollar shortage, not a won shortage. Two executives turned to each other with excitement. The chief secretary added that they could even absorb all of Fantasy's dollars by issuing bonds to the Xinjiang Group, as long as they offered higher interest than Fantasy Investment's annual returns. One man asked whether Fantasy would accept such an offer, even with interest. Hatch replied that 1.2 trillion won would need to be exchanged at the current rate. Another clarified that he was referring to interest on bonds for the remaining dollars. Lowering his head, the chairman chuckled, then suddenly burst into loud laughter, declaring that he would handle this problem himself. Curious what happens next? Tap that cheeky bell, subscribe, like, and share.